Okay, for the next session, the 5G ecosystem enablers, it is my pleasure to invite Professor N.K. Goyal, President, TEMA. It is my pleasure to invite Mr. Mahesh Uppal, Director, Comfirst. Mr. Amit Sinha, Director, VP Strategy and Marketing, Tata Communications. Lastly, Mr. Randeep, Raina, CTO, Nokia. Sir, over to you.
थैंक यू वेरी मच। मुझे इस बात का आभास है कि सुबह से आप लोग बैठे हुए हैं, डिस्कशंस होते रहे हैं 5G के ऊपर, लॉट्स ऑफ थिंग्स, बट आई हैव वंडरफुल पीपल विद मी ऑन द डाइस। महेश uppal जी हम सब जानते हैं, टेलीकॉम में बहुत पुराने हैं और काफ़ी स्टेक इनके रहते हैं, काफ़ी यूज रहते हैं। ऑन माई राइट, एज यू नो, वी हैव फ्रॉम टाटा अमित जी, उसके बाद रणदीप जी नोकिया से। 5G पे आपने बहुत कुछ सुबह से सुना है और रोज अखबारों में पढ़ते भी सुनते होंगे। गवर्नमेंट हैज क्रिएटेड लॉट ऑफ हाइप along with industries also. I think the now a stage has come where people are asking for it. When do we get the 5G? There have been lots of reports, lots of committees, including a high-powered committee by the government, TRI's report, Niti Aayog report. So today, this session is basically for the ecosystem enabler. So we will try to discuss something, what are the enablers required for 5G. So what I suggest that let's have first, we will have some thoughts from all the panelists in the beginning, and then we'll ask certain questions. Let's have Mahesh Uppal ji.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here, and it's an honor and a pleasure to speak to you. You may have noticed that you have been cheated. My name was not in the program. And so my sympathies are with you. And that also gives me an opportunity to warn you beforehand that I'm also joining this at a rather late stage. Be that as it may, let me just make a couple of points. I also know that we are not very, we are at risk of delaying your lunch, so that is another thing that I'll try and bear in mind. Now, as far as the 5G ecosystem is concerned, I think several speakers in the morning, and indeed Mr. Goyal himself, have mentioned the role of government and regulators in the business of 5G. In fact, I would argue that not only is the role of government and regulators relevant, in this particular case, it is central. In fact, as some of you who might be economists might know, that the role of governments and regulators is to deal with market failure. And another way of looking at it is this, that 5G, the technology, the use cases, and what the various concerns are with software, whether we are working on the top layer, etc. Virtually each one of these issues is a market issue. And as we know, markets, entrepreneurs, large businesses, small businesses have a way of addressing these issues. Indeed, they have always, throughout history, addressed them. Nobody asked somebody to make a steel mill. Nobody asked somebody to, start riding an auto. Nobody asked anybody to buy an airline. People know where revenues lie. People know what opportunities there are in the environment. Now, the question about 5G. All of us accept that 5G and its success will depend on 2 or 3 major things. And one key issue in this is going to be spectrum. Now, how and when the spectrum is made available and at what price it is made available is going to determine very, very substantially how 5G, first when 5G is deployed and to what extent it is deployed. We know that the kind of numbers, for example, that the TRAI has proposed for the 5G auction will mean that if the price, if the spectrum went at barely the reserve price that is being envisaged, it'll cost close to 5 trillion rupees. In fact, 5 trillion, it might be even dollars, but anyway, that is the kind of numbers we are talking about. Now, the point, as Mr. Matthews also made, is that this kind of funding is simply not available at this time. Now, unless the government decides an alternative approach, which is objective, which is transparent, to allocating this spectrum, we are in for some serious delays. And we must also recognize that all these things will mean that the government's own revenues will, and government's expectation of its revenues will need to be reviewed. And as you can imagine, given the nature of the economy, given the status of our economy, the state of our economy at the moment, this will be a non-trivial issue. So whether the government is willing to accept a lower price, whether the operators are able to mobilize those kinds of resources will eventually determine what 5G, how and when 5G rollout will happen. And this is irrespective of what technologies there are, what standards there are, what use cases there are. All those things are, of course, relevant, important, critical. But I think what is vital is this whole business of spectrum. Without it, nothing is going to move. The second thing, and I will not take more than 2 minutes on that, is the whole issue of licensing. As you are aware, and as Mr. Matthews mentioned and several others have also mentioned, 5G is not going to be a wall-to-wall deployment. 5G provides you 3 critical features. One to do with low latency, first with high bandwidth, high data rates, low latency, and an enhanced IoT environment. Now, each one of these things tells you one critical thing, that the kind of features 5G has, these are features of interest to niche players, niche users. You and I might be perfectly happy with our 4G speeds, or indeed our speeds that we have on the fixed line. Some of us may have some modest needs. I have a little Fitbit on my hand which connects to my phone, and etc. We have so many small IoT devices that we are already using, Amazon Echo, this, that. All of them are working. Now the point is, the kind of scale we are talking about will also actually be of particular interest to niche users and niche players. Now the question is our licensing regime able to address that issue? For example, now if I want to provide high data speeds in, let's say, a part of Bombay, because there is a huge amount of content and let's say video, etc., being produced and has to be used, or in another very, very core area where somebody wants to do, let's say, remote surgeries using low latency technologies. Now, each one of these things will require niche players. This is not the kind of thing that typically the vanilla telecom operator will do. This is typically what VNOs will do in the market. This is what MVNOs will do in the market. And as you know, both those things have actually been kind of stillborn in India. We have actually had both of those things, both of those types of operators been allowed for several years in the market, but they haven't taken off, again because of regulatory constraints, whether it is to do with spectrum sharing, whether it is to do with allocating AGR, whether it is to do with multiple parenting of MVNOs, etc. Now, each one of these issues is a regulatory issue, is an issue that regulators and governments together will have to figure out. The TRAI probably will recommend something, the government will have to take a final call. So what I'm saying is that in two very critical aspects, one, the very deployment of 5G, second, in the use of its core features, the role of regulation is going to be very, very central. It's vital, and if we do not address it in time, we should expect a lot of delays. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mahesh ji. Thank you for bringing out the issue of spectrum and licensing, both of which are very relevant. I want to ask my very august gathering here, are you aware that India is manufacturing and exporting 5G? Anybody knows the answer? Anybody else? Okay. I want to introduce you to Mr. On my extreme right, Mr. Randeep, Raina, CTO of Nokia. I understand that they are manufacturing and exporting 5G equipment from India. Randeep, over to you for your views.
Yeah, thank you, Goyal Saab, and good afternoon. It's indeed an honor and privilege to be here with you all. There's a lot of buzz around 5G in the marketplace, and I must say that, it's rightly so, because we see a lot of development in 5G across the continents, across the globe, across the markets, and the latest statistics show that almost 47 networks have gone live. There are 113 countries who have shown interest. They are studying the spectrum and trialing. 13 are on the anvil of almost announcing it very shortly. And there is spectrum discussion happening in most parts of the world. So there's a buzz, and it's a reality also, given the fact that we have already seen live deployments with 5G standards, 5G equipment. So from a technology standpoint, I don't think we are way off in terms of adopting 5G in any marketplace. Now, referring to Dr. Goyal's question about Nokia being a lead in terms of manufacturing and supplying 5G outside of India, that's true. We took an early lead in getting our manufacturing facility ready to adopt this transformational change that 5G brings in. While there is no 5G spectrum, but what we did is transformed our Chennai manufacturing, where we supply radio equipment, core equipment. We ensure that it is adapting the changes that technology brings, which improves our efficiency, productivity, and transform that facility itself, which will be ready for 5G as and when 5G networks get live out here. So what we have done is transformed our network on a private LTE with one of the operators who is supplying a connectivity layer, and removed all the Wi-Fi, LAN, Ethernet cables, and it's fully running on a private LTE connectivity today. While we are doing so, we are looking, we have seen some quantum improvements in our productivity in terms of how we do the skill ramp up, because getting a skilled labor is not that easy, and to retain them is also very difficult. So we are using the power of connectivity to enable more people and impart them skills to be able to do things in the right way and in the most cost optimal way. And alongside that, what we also did, given the fact that India is a potential big market for 5G, given the fact that we have big rollouts, the geography is too huge, we kind of anticipated this need and looked at how India could become a hub for 5G manufacturing. and how can we also look at exporting, equipment outside of India. So from that standpoint, while there are discussions happening on a spectrum side, regulatory, things are getting sorted out. Operators, regulators, stakeholders in 5G industry are working out how fast we can get 5G to the table. But we have already made plans and already addressing the needs of the market much before the networks go live. So that's kind of looking at how we prepare and plan better to address this transformational change that 5G brings to the marketplace.
Thank you, Randeep. Yes, we are proud of you because you have a very good factory already on 4.0 and people are using it as a showcase for India. Thank you. Now, again, next to me, right, is Amit Sinha from Tata. I just want to share with you, maybe some of us know, some of us maybe for the first time, about 30% of traffic of internet of the world passes through their networks. Amit Sinha ji, for you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goyal, for that very kind introduction. So Tata Communications, erstwhile VSNL, as some of you may remember, does have that, and we are actually increasing that to more than 30% as we go forward. So whilst you will not see Tata Communications getting into the spectrum bidding and the front-end play, we are very much ecosystem and infrastructure provider for all the networks, including 5G as it rolls out, right? Now, coming back to the discussion of the topic today on 5G ecosystem, and I'd like to echo what Dr. Uppal said. I was also in a different panel and I got pulled in, but then, the topics are, I would say, very much aligned, so that from that perspective, hopefully the discussions will also be aligned and bring value. So when we talk about the ecosystem, there are three things that I look at. One is, of course, the infrastructure, and I think there's been a lot of discussions on spectrum and the radio and all of the other things, and I'll cover a little bit about it from my perspective. The second most important part of the ecosystem is the use case and the applications, right? What good is an infrastructure if there is no real tangible benefit that we can draw with applications and use cases? And finally, the third aspect that I look at is the users themselves, right? There has to be somebody who wants to use that application, somebody who would pay for it, right? If that application doesn't have any relevance or context, however good that may be, it will not be monetized. And if it's not monetized, then all the spectrum fees and everything that we talk about, will lead to very large losses. So from an ecosystem perspective, I would say these are the three top things that are there on my mind. Now, starting with infrastructure, we've talked a lot about spectrum and a lot of effort and planning that is going behind spectrum. Not only by us here in India, but every country, I would say, whether it's Europe, Americas, rest of the Asia-Pacific countries, doing spectrum allocation, spectrum harmonization, and what have you. But what is spectrum? Is it something that we need to manufacture? Is it something we need to design? Is it something that needs investment to get out into the market? We touch it and feel it? No, it is not, right? It's just a band of radio frequency waves that we would allow somebody to use, right? It's freely available for everyone to use if you could, but you cannot, because all the governments in all the countries have actually licensed the use of it, which is fine. It's the monetization of that. But I think what is happening in many cases is that, from my personal perspective, and it's my personal viewpoint, is that we are spending undue amount of effort and deliberations on this aspect, the spectrum aspect, where there is so many other things that we need to look at in order to make 5G or 4G or any G for that matter, 6G which comes in future, a real proposition for countries, for the world, for the region and for the world. So with that spectrum bit out of the way, I thought I must mention that. What are the other areas that we need to look at? Clearly, the ability to convert that into the access, into the last mile, would require us to have the number of requisite towers right? And we've spoken about that, the millimeter wave, etc., rest of the discussions before this. But it is also something that may come back to haunt us. We leapfrogged, if you recall, we leapfrogged the wired world, if we may call it, with 3G and 2G and 3G and 4G by going mobile, right? And that leapfrog may now come back to haunt us because 5G is actually an extension of a wired network, of a broadband network, right? So if we do not have the requisite infrastructure in place in terms of fiber or cable, right, to actually power those 5G radio stations, then it is going to be very difficult to be able to harness the power and bandwidth and low latency of 5G. So 5G does require the fiber or the wired infrastructure, perhaps not the last mile, right? The last mile will be wireless, but in order to get those base stations going. So that's another area where the ecosystem needs to really look at. Now, of course, with that out of the way, the backhaul, and that was touched upon, is the operator connection to those 5G towers, which is important. That is also fiber. But within the operator network, there has to be a lot of changes that need to be made in order to be able to deal with the speeds, in order to be able to provide that data capacity and the low latency. So network function virtualization, software-defined networks, or SDN and NFV as they're called, and several other such technologies would have to be deployed by the operators so that they are then able to effectively feed the speeds and feeds of this 5G network, right? Devices, I think devices were talked upon. We do see, I'm a device geek. I love to follow all the devices. I do have a Nokia as well. I know you don't make it, HMD does, but I love the device. Oh, you have one, lovely. I have the 7 Plus. So devices, and you're already seeing some 5G devices coming in. But that's only scratching the tip of the iceberg, because I think, like we've all spoken about, 5G is not really a consumer play at this time. 5G is a B2B play primarily, right? 5G is about smart cities, smart homes. Yes, you may have, driverless cars, etc., coming in. But because of the density that is required, because of the capacities required, primarily in the initial phases, 5G is going to be a business-to-business or an enterprise play. That is what the analysts have been saying. The other aspect of 5G that also comes up is the ability to actually take this to the rural areas. So I do see, smart agriculture, like smart cities, right? But I'm afraid that, we may not be able to have the level of density required in rural areas that we can potentially provide in urban areas, because you can, 5G requires multiple times more antennas than 4G because of the short throw. So yes, we could put it in bus stations, we could put it in lampposts, we could put it multiple places, install them the small cell antennas and make sure that you have a good 5G coverage in a dense urban area. But when it comes to the rural areas, then it becomes more difficult to have that density and to be able to provide that 5G coverage and experience. So my question then would be, would 5G deployment also drive, a digital divide, right? Because, you would have 5G capabilities in urban areas and not in the rural areas. So again, from an ecosystem perspective, we also have to ensure that we are able to provide 5G equitably across wherever the use cases are required, whether it's urban or in rural. With that introduction, let me pause, and then we can get into further discussions and deliberations.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you. I think I would like to compliment PGA, Pradeep and Ibrahim, I'm not seeing here today, for this wonderful panelist with me. And to me, at least in the last 2 years, this is one of the rare occasions where we have got the clarity from Mahesh, need of spectrum, licensing. From Amit, we may have more digital divide. We need to give focus again on fixed. And from Randeep on the manufacturing parts and these things. So what I want to do, I want to change the pattern of panelists. I would like to throw open it to the floor so that we can have some questions which are in your mind and we can try to answer it. So I open it to the floor for questions. While others are getting ready, I want to ask Amit now, the last speaker. As you said rightly, the fixed line is important. The problem we are seeing is that nobody is talking of fixed line in India now. We have been talking mobile, and virtually there is decline in the fixed line. So how do we promote and bring awareness for fixed line?
Thank you, sir. And whether we call it fixed line or whether we call it fiber, it is actually the connectivity that is required across the entire location where we want to make 5G active, right? There are radio access network capabilities that can be deployed in lieu of fiber, in lieu of what we popularly call as fixed line. But in order to harness the power of 5G with the capillarity that is required across the entire length and breadth of a city, it would require fiber to be laid, right? So there is no getting away from that. Without having that in place, unless a new technology emerges which can feed those base stations, fiber is required. However, there are other capabilities that are being looked at. Satellite, right? Satellite, geostationary or non-geostationary. If there are applications that require high bandwidth but can withstand high latency, you don't need low latency, there is possibility to use satellite to also provide a high-speed network capability to those towers, perhaps even in rural areas, but then at the cost of latency, because the latency is going to be high. So there are trade-offs which are there. If you want low latency, high speed, then it has to be fiber. Otherwise, there could be other solutions which are there. So coming back to your question, sir, there is no getting away from it. We would have to invest in that infrastructure, whether the government provides it like we provide for electricity, water. Actually, electricity is also partially privatized now, but just the way we do municipal water, supply, sewage, power, electricity, so on and so forth, we may have to look at this, along the same lines.
Thank you, Amit. Randeep, there has been lots of talk about the security concerns, and okay, Mike, please, let me ask this question, then come to you. There has been a lot of talk on the security questions prevailing about 5G or so, and there is something going on in the government which says that the best way to be secure is to make 5G in India. What do you think we should do as a policy, other things for making India in 5G?
I think, there are better functions and better departments in the government to look into this matter. From our perspective, we always ensure and comply that the products that we supply to any market, and in this case, India, are completely compliant to the security standards, as defined by 3GPP, HC, or any other, standards body. I don't think, from a protocol standpoint, anything is getting deviated in the products since Nokia supplies that. But what I would also want to say is that sometimes we are overburdening the standards to an extent that it becomes a big issue. But what I would say from a policy standpoint, I think government needs to, have a visibility to what's happening across the markets where 5G is deployed, get a better sense of, the protocols, get a better sense of how, vendors are playing into this, whole security game plan. But, I think, it's not such a issue which can be, solved between. I think departments will have to discuss between MHA and this National Security Advisor. They will have to work out basis some intelligence that has been gathered from other markets and work out a framework which is best suited for India. From a protocol standpoint, as I said, that as a lead manufacturer and as a lead supplier in India, we have always ensured that the equipment that goes into the networks are stringent enough to meet the security standards, and we are committed to follow and comply to those standards, whatever comes in the form of either a regulation change or a policy standard. So that's how we want to take it.
Thank you, Randeep. Yeah, somebody was there.
Good afternoon, eminent panelists. My question is,
Introduce yourself for...
Sure. My name is Vivek Datta, and I'm part of an organization called Concentrix. We are a leading business services provider to most of the global MNCs. My question is, coming from an Indian, perspective, we take a lot of pride in saying that, we have been on the revolutionary side or on the disrupting side of the telecom, new age revolution practices. What are some of the lessons learned from your viewpoints from what 5G leaders today, whether it is South Korea or whether it is China or whether it is some of the key players in US, have told us that we could not possibly anticipate, while still maintaining that proud tag of being a leader in the telecom space.
Thank you. Anybody else? Then we'll have together. If not, can you address his question?
Well, the candid answer is not really, but let me, and I'm not sure I get the question, but I would suggest that, is your question that we have excellence and how can we leverage it? Is that the question?
So we haven't been really in the leading space when it comes to the 5G technological revolution. I mean, we are not far behind, we are catching up. But some of the nations that are ahead of us, what are some of the best things that they have done that we possibly in hindsight can learn from and therefore, bring ourselves ahead of the race when the next generation is about to roll out?
Okay. Again, I will attempt a more general answer, but I think one key difference between us and them is that they have been single-minded in pursuit of their industrial, of ensuring that their industries are successful. These are very, very seriously market-driven economies, which means, and I'll tell you, I'll share something with you which might be relevant, and which is this, that I worked with several agencies. For example, I used to work with the Canadian agency at one time, which was involved in Canadian development projects. But it was very interesting that the focus there was to make sure that opportunities for Canadian industry were also coupled with the kind of aid or the kind of assistance that these agencies were providing. The point is that the goal was to ensure that their own industry also managed to benefit from what it was trying to do. Now, I think one of the things we have actually not done as a country, and having seen other countries operate, is that I don't think our own missions are actually battling for our industry. Our own international embassies, etc., are not. And I think a part of the reason is also the kind of output we have to offer. And I think our inability to leverage the limited amount of excellence we have in some of our premier institutions is one. But also to expand that has been a big challenge. We have, other than these islands of excellence, our own standards of education and engineering and design, etc., across India are still very, very problematic. And I think, again, this is a major contrast between countries that have done well or better than us, that they have actually focused as much on key institutions as they have on the larger ecosystem of their own countries.
Mr. Randeep, you want to add something? I think the question is that now that we have around 50 commercial launches world over, is there any lessons India should take?
I think a lot of lessons, but India has been always innovative. So whatever we learn from global markets cannot be fully replicated in India because of the nature of our deployments here because of the demography that we have in India. But one thing that is coming out to my mind is a very clear policy framework and a cohesive ecosystem that has played very well in other markets like Korea, UK, US, Japan, where government has been very actively involved in 5G discussions right from the beginning. Forget about the deployment, that's an operators and CSPs play. But in terms of a policy making, there was a tighter alignment between a regulator, the market forces, which is basically the operators, ecosystem players like device manufacturers, OEMs, and also how 5G could really change the way things are being done in 4G or 2G. And that's where one of the beautiful things that happened in other markets was a commitment from the government. Commitment to the extent that UK government put in almost 50 million pounds worth of investment to create an incubation center in London which can house incubations of use cases for Europe, or for UK, I'm sorry. Where they invited startups, they invited OEM partners, and started developing some of the use cases which will solve the problems of the common man in UK. Similarly, in European Union committed 700 million euros worth of investment into creating 5G awareness in Europe, which has been in depression for quite some time because of the landscape, telecom landscape in Europe. That we see somehow, missing in India at this point in time. While we talk about spectrum, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about, use cases, but then the commitment and a holistic approach of how we could transform this 5G policy framework with a long-term roadmap is something where there's a lot of scope for improvement. For example, a lot of industries in India are still running on, primitive technologies. There is a scope of transforming those industries to the next-gen technologies. They're not even today using 2G connectivity or 3G connectivity. They are still being run on Wi-Fi or Ethernet and LAN. With 5G, it will completely change the landscape of all those industries. But are we involving the Ministry of Industries into the discussions? Is FICCI or CII or ASSOCHAM, who are the industry associations, are they actively participating in these discussions and bringing the industry problems to the fore of the regulators or to the operators? Maybe yes, but not to that extent it should ideally have been. I think that's one of the learnings that we have seen in other markets. Technology, it is just a matter of how you roll it out with some major changes in specifications or requirements or features. I think with all 55 commercial networks, it has now proven that technology works. Device ecosystem players are committed, and we have seen those networks launched with almost every device partner and every vendor. But what is missing, in my opinion, and that's a learning that we need to take, is how government, ecosystem partners, industries who will eventually be a beneficiary of this transformation technology come together and create a long-term plan for India. And that's what exactly happened in other markets. Having said that, it's not that we have lost the game. I think we still have time, but we shouldn't wait for a situation when networks get deployed and then we start talking about, oh guys, we should have done this much before. I think we still are on the right track, but a holistic approach of how the whole ecosystem around the multiple facets of stakeholders in this country come together and create a good 5G environment in India is something which is needed badly.
Thank you. Thank you, Randeep. Amit, you want to add something?
Yes, thank you, Goji. I'll just add a slightly different perspective. Dr. Uppal mentioned about the responsibilities that the government, in terms of rolling it out for 5G and the policies and so on and so forth. I think, Randeep, you talked about stringent policies, looking at how perhaps the industries put them in the other countries and having that as a best practice. I want to just flip it over in terms of the lens and talk about how there is an equal responsibility on the industry, right, on the corporates, to also make sure that they compete fairly. And when I mean by compete fairly, it's about providing a better service, right, that is more tuned to what the customer needs, rather than perhaps trying to change policy, right? Which is something that we have seen happening in the past. Instead of having a competition which is based on better products, more ubiquitous services, it's about how can we work with the government to tweak the policy so that my competitor fails, right? And it could be getting better slots for airlines, and it could be at the lowest level, nothing to do with the government, but one taxi app aggregator taxi service, keeping on booking and cancelling the other services, taxis, to keep them busy and not allow them to do business. So those kind of things, I think, are just distractions, and just at the end of the day, don't help in any way to provide better services, 5G or any other services for that matter. So that corporate responsibility, I think, is also something that we should focus on.
Thank you, Amit. I think I must thank him for the question, because that has brought us to almost the end. Okay.
Good afternoon, sir. My name is Manish Agarwal. I work for the Quality Council of India, QCI. Actually, I have been hearing very enlightening comments from both in the introductory session as well as in the inaugural session. So actually, the topic for today's discussion is India 5G evolution. India 5G evolution, empowering business customers, fast-tracking 5G. So, as per Sukanda Day's presentation, we got to know that basics of 5G, 1G to 5G, how it has evolved and what changes it will bring about. So 5G, as per that, 5G is a revolutionary technology which is going to change how we use the mobile. Mobile technology is becoming a data-driven technology, and nowadays, actually, presently we have to wait. Actually, there is a lag time. When we use the mobile for anything, there is a wait or lag time. So I believe that with onset of 5G, it will end. So it will not only empower business customers, it will empower everybody who is going to use 5G. So not only business customers. Secondly, it was informed that ITU, International Telecommunication Union, has a ICT Development Index, Information Communication Technology Development Index, in which India ranks 134th, and our target is to be in the first 50 ranks in that index. So it is said that India is going to lead, and India is a leading country, and but so many countries have already launched 5G, South Korea, China, USA, and India is we are still talking about it. 2 years have passed, we are hearing 5G, and still somebody told me that it is going to take at least 2 more years before commercial rollout of 5G is going to take place in India. So why we are not, on the software side, India is a leading country, but on the hardware side, India is a laggard. That is a reality. So if we do the reality check, India is not, India is lagging behind. So how we can fast track 5G launch in India, and how we can benefit individuals and public by use of this technology. Thank you.
I think thank you, and I would answer your question by also having the brief. While government talks of 5G, are they not bothered for the revenue? The first thing government needs, do they want revenue or 5G or technology? As of now, they talk of 5G, but they talk of revenue. That is the first problem. Leave aside that we have started or not, we are ready. We have the manufacturers with us. People have also demonstrated 5G in India, our operators. The second thing is that 5G, as of now, is being talked mainly between telecom-centric bodies or companies. But what we need is talk beyond that. Talk with agriculture, talk with education, talk with medical. And third thing, as was given the panel, is it going to be cost effective? And I just want to inform Randeep here that as an association, we are perhaps the rare body who is looking into all these things in a holistic way. We don't talk only this section, everywhere we are talking. 5G will come, but if there is a demand from your side, then operator will bring tomorrow. So demand is also being generated over the period of time. With this, I think we'll close and hand over to Pradeep. Thank you.
Thank you. May I request you to please hand over mementos to them? First to Dr. Mahesh Uppal. Mr. Amit Sinha. And to Mr. Randeep Raina.
Thank you very much.
Let's have lunch. We'll be back at 2:30.